Let's tell ourselves that's what's happened. Okay. All right, let me get this up and running. All right, today we're going to talk about the things that actually lead us to going into civil war. So, and we're going to focus pretty much on like one specific deal breaker, but we'll talk about it. Some of this stuff we've already actually covered, but I want us to be aware. Jordan, why are you being mean, Jordan? Okay, but I want us to be aware that these were factors. The growth of the Underground Railroad was operating out of churches and printing shops, printing presses, churches, shops, craftsmen's shops, blacksmiths' houses, farmers' houses. More and more places were identifying themselves as pieces of the Underground Railroad and allowing slaves to escape from these states here, which are, in our central but slightly northern region, and up into the northern states where slavery had been abolished, and then up into Canada, where they could escape from the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was one of the pieces of the Fugitive Slave Act made it necessary that people flee further away. And that was because it became so illegal to help slaves escape and so much easier to just return slaves to freedom. And it made it punishable. You could be arrested for assisting in an escape. You could be arrested for being a white person who was harboring fugitive slaves. If you were known to associate with runaway slaves, you could be brought up on charges. People could come in from the southern states to hunt slaves, and if they didn't find specifically the person they were looking for, they tended to go and find people who sort of looked like the person they were looking for and take them. And so it became very dangerous for even freed people who had been born free in the northern states to live in the northern states, because fugitive slave hunters were able to come up and even sort of grab people off the street. And if you were arrested as a runaway slave, you couldn't represent yourself at trial. You couldn't be tried by a jury of your peers. You would be tried by a jury of old white guys, basically, and they would decide whether or not you were actually a runaway or a free person, if you ever made it to trial at all. More likely, what would happen is that you would just be brought down far enough south that nobody would come looking for you. There were no advocates. There weren't advocates for people in this position. So the railroad has to extend further north, and the people who had kind of wishy-washy feelings about the railroad, like, I don't particularly want to help fugitives, but I don't think it's right what we're doing, suddenly became very polarized. Like, no, this is wrong. You can't make all of us northern states into a bunch of slave hunters. We abolished slavery 100 years ago. You can't make us do this, 50 years ago, not 100. But anyway, like for instance, in Pennsylvania, slavery has been abolished since 1807. Suddenly now, you are looking at your neighbor as a possible person who's helping slaves, and if you don't turn them in, you could get in trouble. In Pennsylvania, where this has been a thing since 1807. So obviously the North is very angry about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So we're going to talk about this particular person who was angry about it, and we're going to get more in depth talking about John Brown. If you say so. I mean, let's think about it. This was the person that's not a psycho, right? This is Harriet Tubman, who ran into plantations, ran out with slaves, brought them up into Pennsylvania, and then found out that they had to continue to flee to Canada, right? I mean, and her behavior is not psycho because she didn't murder the plantation owners when she went through, right? This is a person who has been part of an underground railroad system since he was a little boy. His father was a station master on the Underground Railroad. He ran a station out of his tannery, and when he sent his kids to school, he sent them to school with abolitionist teachers on purpose to make sure that they, got the education of an abolitionist. They were taught from a very young age to fight against slavery. Indoctrinated into abolitionism, maybe. I mean, what you teach your children is kind of, it helps to shape them as adults. There are certain moral issues that I am, that I focus on with my kids, and other ones where I'm like, you can decide for yourself, but the ones where I don't think they can decide for themselves are deal breakers for me. So, if they grow up and they don't feel that way, we're going to have a face off at some point as adults. He sent his children to, including John Brown, to be educated by abolitionists because he was running an underground railroad too. He was running an underground railroad station. So when John Brown became an adult, he established his own tannery because he had been trained as a tanner by his father. He established his own tannery and also dedicated that as an underground railroad station. So he became one himself. He wanted to be a minister. He didn't want to be a tanner. He wanted to be a preacher, but he couldn't survive seminary because his eyes were bad. Because his eyes were, his vision was so bad that reading was hard for him. So he couldn't get through all of the reading. So he built his own tannery and he set it up. And over the course of 10 years, 1825 to 1835, over the course of 10 years, 2,500 slaves, runaway slaves, passed through his tannery. So, and he kept some records of them. So we do actually know who some of them were. In 1837, he became a crusader. He stood up in a church. He was angry because abolitionist printer Elijah Lovejoy, who was a printer who printed a newspaper that John Brown's family read, was burned to the ground by people who were opposed to Elijah Lovejoy's abolitionist printings, about how slavery is evil and stuff. His place was burned to the ground. John Brown saw that as a personal affront against abolitionism and stood up in a church and swore that he would see slavery end. I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery. And I guess that was impressive. In the moment, I think people were probably pretty terrified of him. He himself had 13 children, but only 4 of which actually lived to adulthood. In 1842, he went bankrupt. His tannery went bankrupt, and 4 of his children in 1843 died of dysentery in the same year. So he had kind of a bad year in 1843. So in 1846, he moved his family to Springfield, Massachusetts, and built another station. He established another station in Massachusetts, which is good because that's further north, and we haven't gotten to 1850 yet, but in 1850, in Massachusetts, he formed an organization called the Gileadites. Anybody know who Gilead was? You got to know your Bible. Yeah. Anybody have any idea who Gilead was? What Gilead was?
I only know it from the show.
It's not a who, it's a what, but it's a place. Anyway, it doesn't. You can Google it and look it up if you want to. But he created this league specifically to protect runaways. So they would be like, those bikers that show up for child protective services that park in your driveway and prevent people from coming to, harass you. It was like a group like that. They would show up if somebody was, facing arrest and was hiding, then they'd show up to protect the house they were hiding in. They also provided other kinds of protection like funds, jobs, changed identities, things like that. So it was an underground service. It wasn't a let's go and fight this in Congress kind of service. It was an action group that operated, under the radar and sort of illegally in a lot of places. Again, still not a psycho because he's doing things illegally that are the same kinds of things Harriet Tubman is doing. He's providing people with identities that are fraudulent to protect them from being sent back south. He joined that group of people in Massachusetts that was being basically paid to move to Kansas that we talked about on Monday. Y'all remember them? The Beecher's Bibles people that were moved into Kansas specifically so that Kansas would have a larger population of abolitionists than it did slave owners, the Jayhawkers. He joined that group and moved his sons into Massachusetts. And then he joined them to fight against the Border Ruffians. So after the Border Ruffians sacked Lawrence and the grand jury did not find them guilty, John Brown moved down to where his sons were and brought them together and them and a couple of other men and carried out what we talked about on Monday was the Potawatomi massacre, in which he led 29 men. Yeah. In which he led 29 men and took 22 men prisoner. So he went vigilante, and then people came and burned his homestead down. Henry Pate came and burned his homestead down. And there's vigilante justice going back and forth. He's got a mob of his own. Henry Pate has a mob of his own. They're leading battles against each other. And in 1856, a militia from Missouri marched into Osawatomie, where John Brown's son lived, and shot and killed him. John Brown's men staked out the road and ambushed the militia, killing 20 of them, wounding 40 of them, and capturing 4 of them. The leader of the militia got the better of them and drove them into the woods. And then that militia from Missouri went on to plunder the town. Okay, so John Brown was trying to have these little showdown battles all over the place. He was trying to have these little vigilante battles all over the place. Potawatomi was the first time he went in and got people out of their house and tried them on the front lawn and then killed them. But the answer from Missouri was a militia force that was coming after him. He was being joined by people who were tired of all this talking about abolitionism. He managed to always grab people and bring them around who wanted to take action. That was his whole thing. We talk too much, we need to start taking action. This has been literally going on since 1619. Slavery has been going on in this country nonstop for 230 years. Talking about it is not going to end it, was John Brown's basic position. In 1857, there was a lawsuit, and that lawsuit, Dred Scott versus Sanford, the basic case goes like this. A slave who had been moved with his master out of Missouri, so he followed his master out of Missouri into Kansas because he had no choice. His master was a border ruffian, basically. And because he had been transported across state lines, he sued for his freedom. And then more than 10 other cases came before the Missouri Supreme Court. And as a result of that, the Supreme Court had to rule on whether or not the Missouri Compromise was actually constitutional, which is what abolitionists had hoped would happen all along, except that when they did rule it unconstitutional, what they said was that whether a state is slave or free should be a matter of popular sovereignty, which means whether they're south of that line or north of that line, that should be a matter of popular sovereignty. And as a result of that, because of what it says in the Constitution, a slave can't be taken away from his master even if he crossed the state lines. Well, that was okay, now there's definitely a line between the abolitionists and the slave owners, because now a slave owner can travel anywhere in the US with his slaves, no matter whether the state votes itself to be free soil or not. So if Kansas had voted itself to be a free soil state, then after this decision came out, what would stop people from moving into Kansas with their slaves and being allowed to keep them? You know, as Colorado forms, if it's a free soil state and then slave owners move into it with their slaves, and those slaves can't be taken away from them, then what's the point of designating it a free soil state? Do y'all understand that? I don't want you to lose sight of why this was an important decision. Why the US Supreme Court ruling that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, ruling that everything should be popular sovereignty. It's important that you understand why that was a deal breaker for the North, for the abolitionists. Okay, and that's because the worry for slave owners is if slavery doesn't expand, it dies. So the thing they're most scared of is that new states, as they form, will be free soil states. But if this law makes it possible for them to move their slaves into free soil states and keep them as slaves, then there's literally no such thing as a free soil state. Does that make sense? Okay, so this was bad news and really, really pissed off our crusaders. Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas faced off with each other over this. Abraham Lincoln said, "We think that the Dred Scott decision is erroneous. We shall do what we can to have it overruled." And Stephen Douglas said, Mr. Lincoln goes for warfare upon the Supreme Court of the United States. This is actually rhetoric y'all have heard in the last couple of years, isn't it? The biggest thing about the presidential elections has been, what does that mean for the Supreme Court? Because whoever gets appointed to the Supreme Court is going to be able to change the laws, right? He did, and yet somehow they didn't rule in favor of the laws that he had in mind. It's really weird. The Supreme Court's job is to interpret the Constitution. That's their whole job. But if you have people of a certain viewpoint filling the Supreme Court, then the way that they interpret the Supreme Court is going to be, now, and the Constitution does actually say that somebody whose slave runs away to, it actually says that, it's in Article 4, it's right there in the Constitution. So a liberal interpretation or a conservative interpretation, a abolitionist interpretation versus a pro-slavery interpretation, these are human beings on the Supreme Court. So when Abraham Lincoln says we will do what we have to do to have it overruled, what the rest of the country hears is, so you're going to change the nature of the Supreme Court because you're trying to stop them from doing their job. All right, so this is at this point where John Brown begins to gather forces. After the Dred Scott case passes in 1857, he begins to gather funds, men, and information. He begins to meet with leaders of the abolitionist movement. I'm sorry, but you're like 10 feet away from me, right? Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna take this off. We're far enough away. I'm sorry, but I can't breathe. I'm like, okay, let's keep talking. Sorry. I know, it makes a big difference too. I'm not Hannibal Lecter anyway. It's like the whole thing. All right, anyway. He starts to gather forces. He goes and meets with Frederick Douglass. He goes and meets with Harriet Tubman, and he begins to discuss his strategy. He believes in his heart of hearts that he can lead an attack that if you open, that it'll be like an explosion going off. If you lead the right kind of attack in the right area of the South, all of the slaves will rise up and revolt. And not the masters, all of the masters of all the plantations together can't stop that kind of revolt. It worked in Haiti, that he believes that he can actually cause that kind of revolt. So we're just gonna watch this little 5-minute video here. Hopefully. Yeah, I watched like 5 minutes of that episode and I was like, if he doesn't stop drooling, I'm not going to be able to watch this show. I have a problem with that. So, yeah, her, well, it's not just that, but it says iPhone, so she just wants to make sure that I know who that is.
Oh. Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna try this. I hope y'all can hear it.
The father of American terrorism. An inspiration for the civil rights movement. Madman or martyr. Murderer or hero. John Brown's Holy War.
On Sunday evening, October 16, 1859, the radical abolitionist John Brown led 5 blacks and 13 whites into Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He brought along a wagon load of guns to arm the slaves he was sure would rally to him. Once they had, he planned to lead them southward along the crest of the Appalachians and destroy slavery. Brown was an inept businessman who had failed 20 times in 6 states and defaulted on his debts. Yet he believed himself God's agent on earth. In 1856, at Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas, he and his sons had hacked 5 pro-slavery men to death with broadswords, all in the name of defeating Satan and his legions. Brown and his men quietly seized the armory, arsenal, and engine house and took up hostages, including George Washington's great-grandnephew. After that, nothing went right. The first person killed was the town baggage master, a free black. The slaves did not rise up. Angry townspeople did. The first of Brown's followers to fall was Dangerfield Newby, a former slave. Someone in the crowd cut off his ears as souvenirs. On Tuesday morning, federal troops arrived from Washington, led by a U.S. Army Colonel, Robert E. Lee. Lee's men stormed the engine house, and 9 more of Brown's men were killed, including 2 of his sons. Brown, severely wounded, was turned over to Virginia to be tried for treason.
In firing his gun, John Brown has merely told what time of day it is. It is high noon. Thank God. William Lloyd Garrison.
An undivided South says, let him hang. Albany, Georgia Patriot.
Virginia found Brown guilty and sentenced him to death. Among the troops at the scene of his hanging were cadets from the Virginia Military Institute, led by an eccentric professor, Thomas J. Jackson. Also there was a private in the Richmond Greys, a young actor named John Wilkes Booth.
December 2nd, 1859. Old John Brown has been executed for treason against a state. We cannot object, even though he agreed with us in thinking slavery wrong. That cannot excuse violence, bloodshed, and treason. It could avail him nothing that he might think himself right. Abraham Lincoln.
Ralph Waldo Emerson likened Brown to Christ. Nathaniel Hawthorne declared, "No man ever more justly hanged." And Herman Melville called him the meteor of the war. Brown had said nothing from the gallows, but he did hand one of his guards a note.
I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood.
His zeal in the cause of freedom was infinitely superior to mine. Mine was as the taper light. His was as the burning sun. I could live for the slave. John Brown could die for him.
Okay, so
I was wondering when I saw the Ethan Hawke portrayal why he had.
I'm here and now you want to repeat this in front of
no.
John Brown. John Brown.
Why is autoplay on this thing? Holy, of all the places to have autoplay active in a classroom?
On the video and stuff, like by the closed caption on the video, that little error.
Yeah, but it'd be really bad if it was.
That's what I was
Yeah, maybe it won't happen next time. Okay, so so let's before we get back into the PowerPoint, what do y'all think of John Brown's attempt at Harper's Ferry?
You're just taking out a few more people.
Okay, but you heard what happened, right? I mean, his intent was to roll in there to seize the armory in Harper's Ferry, distribute the 100,000 rifles and guns that were there to slaves on the plantations in Virginia. So he was going to seize the armory, and then he was going to, no, not from the beginning. Oh, nobody has time for this. Okay, here we go. We'll go ahead and get back into it because I have slides for the Harper's Ferry thing. So I'm going to.
No, I think the first person that died.
Okay.
Not gonna free black man.
Well, see, yeah, and that was a problem. The first person his plan was to move his troops into Harper's Ferry, seize the armory, grab the weapons, take them south into Virginia, arm the slaves, and lead a revolt of slaves against their master, right? That was the plan. And as soon as the slaves left the plantation, they don't even have to attack their masters. They just need to leave en masse. And as soon as they do, slavery, the economy of slavery would collapse because all these plantations would fold. Because you can only stop work on a plantation for a certain amount of time before you screw up the whole season. And once you screw up one season, you end up so far in debt that you never recover from it, as we saw in the West Indies when the British had that hiccup in their labor force where they went from slaves to paid labor. And there was a hiccup in the economy because of that. And they barely recovered from it enough to actually maintain any kind of, sugar industry in Britain. That was the idea. Let's just collapse the economy of slavery. Do you think it was a sound idea? He's not necessarily calling for violence against the plantation owners. He's calling for them to leave the plantations en masse, just leave. You think it would have worked? Was it a crazy notion? Was that the part that was crazy? It's based on a couple of flawed assumptions. One of them is that the slaves want to leave. And a lot of them probably do, but they actually don't have any place new to go. So the other one is that now when he presented this plan to Harriet Tubman, she pointed to which armory would probably be the one that worked. Right. He decided to choose Harper's Ferry instead. When he pointed this, when he brought this plan to Frederick Douglass said, "Oh, hell no. This is such a bad idea." And he just decided that Frederick Douglass didn't know what he was talking about. He came into Harper's Ferry and he easily took the armory. They took hostages among the local farmers so they could hold the armory, and they accidentally killed some of the slaves in the process, the farmers' slaves of the hostages they took. And then an incoming train tried to come in, and the baggage master tried to warn the train, "Don't stop here, we have drama." And they watched him do that, and so that they killed him to stop him from doing that anymore. And he happened to be a free black man. So that was when they say the first person to die was a free black man. They didn't just walk into town and go, boom, oh, boom. They were like, it was specifically somebody that was trying to warn incoming trains not to come in. When the federal troops surrounded John Brown's men, they were locked in the train station. They were locked in the engine room of the train station. And yeah, it was Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart, who you'll hear about a lot more on Friday. And also, they basically struck him on the head and arrested him. He was charged with murder. He conspiring with slaves and trying to lead treason in Virginia. Those were the charges against him. The defense attorney said, to be fair, he didn't actually commit these murders himself. Those were his men. And the slaves didn't actually rise up because he never got there. And also, he's not Virginian, so he can't be treasonous against Virginia. And the court sentenced him on all 3 counts. So that was the best his defense could do, basically. This begins a division which causes new parties to form, okay? Because now people are forming on the basis of, are you an abolitionist or not? This is the first time, 1860 is the first time that people have identified their party on this single issue. Up until this point, it was a million other things. Both parties included abolitionists. Both parties included pro-slavery forces. This is the first time that we have actual subsections of parties that are forming based on the question of, do you support slavery or not? There was a party that formed called the Know Nothing Party, literally making a deal not to talk about slavery, to try to change the conversation so that slavery wasn't the center of it. And they were called the Know Nothing Party, but they were pro-slavery. And the reason that they wanted to stop talking about it was because they just didn't want to talk about it. Do we have issues like that we divide on? That whatever other beliefs you have about your party, you have to be part of this part of the party because of this one belief they have? Can you name a couple? Pro-life, pro-choice, pro-life and pro-choice, so abortion. That's one. Can you name another one?
Gun control.
Gun control. That's the one right there. One party is for guns and the other party is against guns. Is that actually true?
Nope.
Is that actually true?
No.
No, there are Republicans who have no interest in enforcing the Second Amendment, gun rights, and there are Democrats who own their own arsenals and have no problem at all having the Second Amendment available to them. But the rhetoric says the most radical factions of pro-gun or anti-gun are in these parties, and therefore the whole party is defined by that. Okay, the most radical pro-choice people tend to be in the Democratic Party, which means the entire Democratic Party is pro-choice. The most radical pro-life, anti-abortion people happen to be Republicans, so the entire Republican Party is pro-life and anti-abortion. I'm not going to have that argument because I think it's more complicated than that. But I will say that actually the most vocal white supremacists tend to be like libertarians, actually, so like outside of both parties. But the KKK often throws its support behind Republican candidates, therefore the entire Republican Party is white supremacist, which is weird considering how much of the Republican Party is Black. But anyway, the point is it's never this simple. There was not, Republican parties are pro abolition and Democrat was pro-slavery. It's not that simple, but there were factions inside those parties that were defined by which side of the issue they came in on. And that's what guided the election of 1860. So all of these groups formed together into the Republican Party, and the Republican Party in 1856, they pulled together, and for the election of 1860, they nominated Abraham Lincoln. Okay? Democrats split in the 1860 convention. The Republicans pulled together and gelled and nominated Abraham Lincoln and got behind. They split the Democrats. There were Northern Democrats who were kind of moderates, more pro-West. They were like, we kind of think maybe ending slavery just right off the bat is a bad thing, but we wouldn't say we're necessarily in support of it. We just wanted to stop talking about it. Northern moderate Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas. The Southern Democrats nominated John Breckinridge, and they threw all their support behind these candidates to the point where at their convention, they actually left and had two separate conventions. So what happens when your party splits so radically that you have to have two different conventions for the same party? Every single time. In every election, when that happens, that party loses. It's the other one, the one that's gels together. So do y'all see this happening in 2024? You think that there's going to be a split in one of the parties in 2024? I don't know. I've always thought we should go the direction of some of the European countries and have like 30 candidates. That would be so much more fun. It is entirely possible that the Republican Party might split and have a separate pro-Trump faction and a more moderate Republican faction. It's possible that can happen in the Democrats too, because that very nearly happened this time, because there were people who were like, Biden seems like the best choice. And then people were like, let's get somebody from like the way radical left and get them in here. So that could happen again, but that definitely happened in 1860. But it doesn't really matter, because there was another party that was formed out of the know-nothings, which are the more radical anti-slavery, that also nominated John Bell. So now we've got 4 candidates. Yes. If they both split, we end up with 4 candidates. Somebody still has to get 51% of the vote. Somebody still has to make enough, because otherwise, do y'all remember? This happened before. This happened when Andrew Jackson ran the first time. Do you know what happens if after election day nobody has 270 electoral votes? It goes to the House of Representatives, and they vote on who the next president is. It just gets taken completely out of the hands of the American people and put directly into their representatives. So that's what will happen, and that's what very nearly happened here, except that this is what the election of 1860 actually looked like. The electoral vote for Lincoln was 59% of the electoral vote, even though not a single state in the South voted for Abraham Lincoln. He managed to still gain enough electoral votes in the North to take the majority and to take the presidency. Now, here's an interesting thing. I don't know if I have a picture of it, do I? I don't think I do. He didn't even I want to qualify that because it's not what you think. The way that elections are set up now, everybody goes to a polling place, you go, they show you the ballot, you pick who you're going to pick, and then you leave, right? But all the ballots across, you know, your state are the same. They're all designed by your state and they're all the same. They're slightly different from state to state. And it is possible for a presidential candidate not to be on the ballot in a state, okay? The way that it happened back then was ballots were printed in the newspaper by your party. So you cut it out and brought it to the polling place. So the Republican one was there and the Democrat one was there. And you know, the weird know-nothing Whig Southern Democrat one was there. And you just cut out the one you agreed with and brought it to the polling place. Okay? And in most Southern newspapers, there was no Republican ballot. So you had a choice between a couple of different other candidates, but Lincoln, the one that with Lincoln's name on it, wasn't printed in any of the Southern papers. And not in some states, The point is that even though he had absolutely no support in the South, according to the electoral vote, he still won without any of the South's support. So as a state in the South, how does that make you feel about your executive representative? Yeah, as a state in the South, you have no representation. You made a choice and were disregarded completely.
It's also kind of interesting how much, how much like Douglas had, but he only had the one state.
Yeah, yeah. Douglas only had one state. He had Missouri, but he only had 4% of the electoral vote. But he had an immense amount of popular support, enough popular support that he was actually ahead of both of these candidates here. But he only had Missouri. Missouri was the only state that supported him, so he didn't win. Obviously, he didn't win. The rolling secession of the Southern states followed immediately after this. Okay, so it is the catalyst. The election of Abraham Lincoln is not the fracture. It's important to me that we note that that's not the thing that broke the states apart. That was the proof positive that we were already broken to the South. They looked at that as proof that they were already separate countries, basically. So 10 different states, I've got it here, 10 different states he wasn't listed on the ballot, okay? So between the election day and the inauguration day, 7 states seceded. And 4 more followed right after the inauguration. Okay, so these are the dates of the secession are on this map here. The first state to secede was South Carolina, because they've been looking to secede ever since that tariff situation with Andrew Jackson. They were looking to become a separate country for a while, and this was now, their opportunity to do so. So the election was in November. They seceded in December. Okay, that was South Carolina, followed by in January, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Florida, and then Texas, which you'll have to take cultural history of Texas to understand their thought process of seceding. But I don't know that they were ever actually part of the United States in their minds. Like, I'm not actually sure the Texans ever thought of themselves as part of the Union up until this point. Like, they were like, yeah, let's go back to being our own country. Now, they didn't form a confederacy. They didn't form a united country at this point. They just left. They declared themselves separate from the United States at this point. And then between April, May, and June, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas seceded. So there we have it. We have the deal breaker. John Brown's trial was a massive separation of ideologies. Was he a hero or a terrorist? Was a big part of it. Abraham Lincoln's election was proof positive to the South that it had already happened, that they'd already been split. So your assignment for today is to look at Lincoln's first inaugural address, which is posted on Blackboard so you can read it. This is going to be the assignment, the only assignment you have all week. And I don't know if the assignment itself is posted yet. It might still be unavailable. I don't know. I'll look at it after class. But I want you to pay attention to specific language in his first inaugural address, because it's important that you know that he is not talking about slavery. He is not threatening to end slavery in his inaugural address. He is functioning with this belief that civil war is in the hands of the South. That if they choose to declare war, that's a decision they're making that he's going to have to stop. And that's based on the myth that all of the South agrees to secede. See, to the North, what they see is a bunch of United States citizens who are being held hostage by their secessionist governments. And if they had any freedom and liberty, then they would choose to be part of the United States. So it's important for the United States government to go in and overthrow these rebel governments and free the Southern people to come back to the United States, which is what they want, okay? Based on that is his inaugural address. So this is the question you need to ask. Who is he talking to, and what does he want them to know? Okay, and you've got until Sunday to answer that question, but I also want you to focus on your paper. So I'm giving this to you today. We'll talk about it again on Friday, and then we'll, yeah, y'all work on that. Okay, any questions?